My name is Cathy Fink. I am a musician, performer, educator of music. I work in American roots music. I'm also a songwriter who loves traditional music and kind of embraces all those roots and branches. And I play some guitar, banjo, ukulele, and fiddle, and sing and dance. And I also am very involved in a lot of the business aspects of what my partner Marcy Marxer and I do, including publications of over 50 CDs at this point and thousands of instructional videos. Those three words, old-time music, encompass so many different things. You can create pictures in your mind of what old-time music might be, but I see it drawn from Southern Appalachian music, which of course is then drawn from African American music, Native American music, European musics, and this melting pot of all these different things that include ballads, dance music, protest songs, social justice music, and pure home entertainment. I think there are two centerpieces for me. One of them is that this was originally completely homemade music. And two is that an awful lot of this music creates community and builds community. Old-time music is often played in groups. Not always. You can have that picture of the solo banjo player on the front porch or the fiddler on the front porch or somebody singing a ballad on the front porch. But really, it is used for communication. And you can communicate between a fiddle and a banjo. You can communicate with a group of singers. You can communicate putting it all together and dancing at the same time. I think that the limited view that a lot of people have of old-time music is based on what they've been exposed to in the media. And it's only recently that there have been some great movers and shakers who have worked hard to make people understand what the real roots of this music is. And as that happens, and some of those people like Rhiannon Giddens, this is something I've been working on for a long time. There's a bunch of folks, Cece Conway, who started the Black Banjo Gatherings. There's a bunch of folks who have worked very hard to say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at where this came from, who's really involved. Let's bring some of those people back. Let's put some of those people forward. And so I think that gradually we are now seeing a more and more full picture of what this is. And I think that's delightful. It's important to highlight the stories of women in old-time music for so many reasons. Number one, it's not a quieter part of our history. I'm going to say that again. Number one, it's a part of our history that has not been said out loud nearly enough. In the same relationship to not showing enough of the diversity of old-time music in the media, in the movies, on television, in all of the ways that people are exposed to this, I feel like the many roles of women in old-time music have been overlooked historically in a lot of situations. And so I think this exhibit helps us to say a lot of important things. Why were women not on tour as much as men? Well, I think there's some obvious reasons there. We've got women who had to take care of the families. And there were some, I'm not going to say strict, but there were some social norms behind that about what men would do, what women would do. And when they're sitting home with 10 kids, the idea that they're going to leave the kids at home and go on the road with their banjos isn't very realistic. I think that's a small part of it. But I also feel like there's a huge piece of this history that's been overlooked because so many of the men that we're familiar with in traditional old-time bluegrass, pre-bluegrass, they were influenced by women whose names didn't get to the forefront, right? Ralph Stanley learned how to play banjo from his mom. And in fact, he gave her great credit for that, did a whole album about it. But you know that sort of old cliche saying, behind every great man is a woman. In the case of old-time music, that's so common. The other thing is I think that women use that music for social purposes, community purposes. They sang to their babies. They sang with their children. You look at Jean Ritchie's family. Women were such an integral part of the upbringing of children in musical ways that the general world wouldn't see that because it wasn't a commercial statement. Nobody was trying to make money from it. And it's when money changes hands that people take notice, or that the media has some new role in all of this. This was happening in homes all the time. You roll back the rug, you have a square dance, mom might be playing the fiddle or the banjo, or she might be calling the dance, or she might be out there teaching the dances in the living room with 3 other neighbors' families. That's not a commercial moment. That's a social music moment. It's a family music moment. And we didn't capture so many of those for the media. So the people that we heard about were really the people where there became some commercial aspect to what they were doing. Sometimes that happened because they were discovered by a folklorist or by someone else, and therefore placed in front of the public in a way that we had the pleasure of hearing what they were doing behind closed doors. And sometimes that happened maybe by accident. But I think there's a turnkey moment in the word commercial. And commercial doesn't have to mean big bucks. It just means when money becomes involved, when there's a commercial transaction, we're being paid for this, or you're being paid for this, and we plan to sell it to someone else, then you have a whole different thing. And I think women had way less opportunities for a very long time. It didn't mean they played less music. They had less opportunities for that commercial moment. And I think that over time, that's been changing. I think the landscape for women in music, and then we're talking about women in old-time music, I think the landscape has improved, but it still has a long way to go. Is there equality out there in all aspects of this? Not yet. You know, does it still happen that, there are a lot of challenges. And I think that it's getting better. There, no. I think we have a long ways to go. But the more women who step up and are willing to put themselves out there and are also willing to mentor the next generation and are willing to teach the men who have not yet embraced the fact that we're here, that's all going to have an impact. And I've been doing this for 50 years. I see a lot of change. You know, I can't really guess why I bonded with this music. I never heard it until I was about 20 years old. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, right down the street from where bluegrass was a hip, happening thing. But it wasn't happening in my neighborhood. And we didn't have public transportation. So, and it wasn't on the media, right? The only thing close to this kind of music that was on the media was Flatt and Scruggs on the Beverly Hillbillies and the occasional other TV show. So I didn't have any exposure to it. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why I feel so passionate about programming all kinds of music into schools and educational institutions. It's about making sure kids hear things that are different than what they are already exposed to. But honestly, I loved acoustic music, and I played guitar. I wrote terrible songs in my teens. And in 1972, I moved to Montreal in Canada, and there was a huge folk scene and community. That's where I heard my first bluegrass band. That's actually where I heard a banjo live and in person for the first time. And the more I heard it, the more I loved it. And I'm going to say, it just pulled me in, you know? And so I had this, and one of the other things, one of my other entrees to old-time music and traditional music was through the Appalachian dulcimer. Now, the entree was through the music of Richard and Mimi Farina. And Richard Farina was a phenomenal dulcimer player, in addition to songwriter in what I'd call folk tradition. But once I got a dulcimer and I learned his music and I started researching who else plays this, I landed with Jean Ritchie. And I started listening to all of her music and learning that music. Well, it didn't hurt that Joni Mitchell also played a dulcimer, and I already knew all of her songs. It's interesting that somebody as non-trad as Joni Mitchell could be one of my entrees to traditional music. But because of her hearing this instrument probably at a folk festival and taking it into her style, you know, that was another open door. Meantime, for the first time, I heard somebody play Freight Train, finger picking it on the guitar. Oh my goodness, how amazing was that? That's where I first heard the music of the original Carter family. Everybody knew Carter family songs. And the next thing you know, I was obsessed. And that obsession led to 3 to 4 hours a day of listening to old recordings, another 3 to 4 hours a day of practicing, making sure that I was connecting with people who could play this music and saying, can you show me something? And so I feel like it's an interesting path that I didn't grow up with, but I did grow up with a lot of music, and I loved music, and it just turned into the big passion. Oh, this was 1980. I entered the West Virginia State Banjo Competition in Glenville, West Virginia. I love that festival. And I won the banjo contest. It was the first time a woman had won, and it was like huge. It was on the front page of whatever the Glenville paper was. And I won that 3 times in a row. And then in 2018, so that was 80, 81, 82, 2018, I became the first woman to take first place at the Clifftop Appalachian String Band Festival banjo contest. Now, at that point, there were, and there are, a lot of women playing. Frankly, what do I think? I actually frankly think lots of women were being overlooked in that process. But I feel like it's an opportunity to bring more women in, bring more women up, encourage more women. I want to go back to another question that you talked about. It's an interesting question about the challenges of women in old-time music. I was greatly encouraged in this music by my first partner, a crazy guy named Duck Donald. We learned every old-time duet there was. I mean, probably 500 of them. I took up the banjo. He encouraged me. He showed me how to flat pick guitar. We had an amazing time playing music. Did about 250 gigs a year for 5 years before there was the internet or cell phones or answering machines. And I booked all of those gigs. But it wasn't uncommon in those days to be at a festival, a folk festival or a bluegrass festival, and have somebody come up to me and say, Wow, pretty good for a girl. Oh my goodness, you're playing banjo. Look, it's a girl and she's playing bluegrass banjo. And I'm thinking, human, got 10 fingers, brain, musicality, what's the deal? And in fact, in about 1984, I was performing in Vancouver. And at that point, I was doing mostly a solo thing. And I was approached by an all-female bluegrass band. And they said, we're having a hard time finding repertoire. Can you lead us to some good repertoire for women? And I was already on this path of digging into the history of women in old time and bluegrass music. Well, that conversation with them led me to write a song called Little Darlin's Not My Name, from which I stole from the best in bluegrass and turned it into this other hook. And it really made me think a lot about that repertoire. And when you look at it, I realized that those 5 years in my first band, I hardly sang lead because none of these songs were things I wanted to sing. They're all about some guy's little darling while he's off having a good time somewhere and she's sitting home waiting for him to come home or whatever it may be. And I was drawn to the feeling. I was drawn to the chordal structure. I was drawn to the harmonies. I learned a lot from that. But as I got a little more mature, as I grew up a little bit, I'm like, I can't sing that stuff anymore. I need to look for songs that really speak to me and where I can speak to other people. And that was a big thing. And there were pockets of people all over starting to do that. And it wasn't a matter of ignoring what happened. It was a matter of curating music from the past that I really wanted to work with, as well as creating some new stuff. And the other thing is that I have been very lucky to meet some amazing women who put those building blocks down for us, right? So one of them is Ola Belle Reed. Ola Belle Reed first of all, she was a phenomenal humanitarian. Yes, she was a musician, she was a songwriter, she was a community activist in a lot of ways, but she was a humanitarian. And that shows up in her songs. Her love of her home place shows up in her songs, even though, early in her life, maybe in her 20s, she had to leave Lansing, North Carolina and move up north, just like lots of rural Southerners for the purpose of finding work and getting by. But she took her music with her, and she deeply knew the traditional music of her family and her heritage. She could play a great square dance. She could sing a great old-time song. She picked a fine banjo. She played guitar. She was a powerhouse individual with a great sense of self and duty. And at some point, she, like several other women I got to meet, said, I like that old stuff, but I've got my own things to sing about. That was really influential to me. And when I moved to Washington, D.C. in 1979, I found out that Ola Belle lived an hour and a half away in Rising Sun, Maryland, and started making trips up there to visit Ola Belle and her husband, Bud, who was incredibly sweet, totally supportive. And you knew who was in charge there. Ola Belle was in charge. And Marcy and I would go up to her house. We'd spend an afternoon. There's always soup on the stove. There's always food there. We sit and visit. We play music together. We go back and forth sharing some music. Her son David would join, who's a fine musician. And that was really wonderful. And in fact, and just to name some of her iconic songs, the most well-known song of Ola Belle Reed's is High on a Mountain. Del McCoury recorded that in 1962. I'm sure it's been recorded 500 times since then. It's been recorded by bluegrass bands. It's been recorded by country bands. Marty Stewart had a top country hit. And Ola Belle actually had a picture of the gold record on her wall. And then, you know, you don't become an old time band without singing High on a Mountain at some point. It's, that's an iconic song. Her song, I've Endured, speaks so much to the hardships that she endured, but it also speaks to her life in the contemporary times that she lived in, watching things unroll with social justice, racial justice, all these things that she was both a witness to and active in. And then I feel like in the last 5 years, there's been a huge renaissance of her beautiful song, Tear Down the Fences. Again, if you want to see an icon in songwriting, songs that stand the test of time. And you can listen to all three of those songs and you can think they were written, you know, 75 years ago or 50 years ago. They'll be sung 50 years from now. Ola Belle was a powerhouse individual. She also, I mean, through her work at Sunset Park and the New River Ranch, she curated so much old-time music. And bluegrass music at the time was very old-time. It was considered old-time. And she curated that. She put it up front. She encouraged people. She encouraged youth. You know, I feel touched by that. I mean, when I say touched by that, it's like laying on of hands, kind of touched by that. And we remained very close with Ola Belle's family, even when she became ill and eventually kind of an invalid. We continued visiting, singing to her, hanging out with Bud. It was great. With Lily Mae Ledford, there's another story, because at the time that I got to meet her, David Holt had a television show on the early Nashville network. I think it was TNN, the Nashville network, and it was called Fire on the Mountain. And someplace along the line, I saw that show a few times, and I'm like, why aren't there any women on this show? And so I wrote the producer. I sent him a letter, and I just said, look, I like your show, I like the music, but there's no women. And here's a list of women that I think you ought to consider. And by the way, here's my latest album. And it was an album called Dog on My Time. It included a song by Cousin Emmy. That was the title song. Dog on My Time comes from the song Cat's Got the Measles and the Dog's Got the Whooping Cough. And lo and behold, he called me. All right, I'm going to get some of these women on my show. Let's talk about it. And then I'm going to get you on the show. And through that, they showcased the Real World String Band and a whole bunch of other people, plus Lily Mae Ledford. Well, I'd been listening to Lily Mae Ledford's music, and they invited me to interview her at the Renfro Valley Barn Dance, which is one of the venues, one of the sort of barn dance kind of shows that she played for a long time, Lexington, Kentucky. And it was hilarious. It was wonderful. Now, when I look back on that, she was probably about the age I am now, or maybe a little bit younger. But I was in my 20s. So anybody over 50 in your 20s is just, you know, one foot in the grave. We had a lot of amazing discussions. And she talked a lot about how hard it was to be a woman doing this commercial music thing. Women were not being respected. They were being ordered around by men. This is what you're going to sing. This is how it's going to work. This is, you know, and I think she stood the test of time in there. We had a great time together. And I think, again, she became a very important person in this music. One of the other people, I just sort of had a habit of, and maybe in the footsteps of the New Lost City Ramblers, it's like, I wonder how many of these people are alive that I could get to meet. Well, it never occurred to me that Patsy Montana was alive when I did a radio show in 1980 in California, And I sang one of her yodeling songs, That's Where the West Begins. And the radio interviewers said to me, well, if you like Patsy Montana, you should go meet her. She lives down the road there in Long Beach. And I phoned her up. They gave me her number. She invited me over her house. Come on over for lunch tomorrow. I get to her apartment. I knock on the door. She opens the door. She says, let me hear you yodel. Like the door's cracked open. And I gave her a little yodel. And she said, well, come on in. We have so much to talk about. Now, and we did. We had a wonderful afternoon that became a friendship until she passed at the age of 86 or something like that. And Marcy and I not only toured and performed with Patsy quite a bit, but we introduced her to folk festivals. A lot of people credit us with bringing her career back, and I don't think that's the case. But what I do think is that we took her to audiences that hadn't really been aware. And in 1935, she became the first woman in country music to sell 1 million records. Now, country music, it was so old time at the time, right? Patsy played guitar, she yodeled. Her backup band, the Prairie Ramblers, were essentially an acoustic swing string band. Already they were merging all these different kinds of music. Interestingly enough, Patsy worked with Lily Mae Ledford at the WLS Barn Dance in Chicago. They became friends. In fact, Patsy told me that she helped Lily Mae learn how to get by in a city, because Lily Mae had really come from rural Kentucky and had never dealt with going places on a bus or using money for everything. You know, it was a whole new experience for her. And at the same time, WLS was this amazing breeding ground for these great women in old-time music. The girls of the Golden West, the Desurick sisters, who were also known as the Cackle Sisters. Now, in probably 1977 or 78, I visited a man in Frederick, Maryland named Joe Buzzard Jr., one of the most prolific collectors of 78s in the world. And in that gigantic collection of 78s were tons and tons of old-time music. And so I went to his house, and he would, you know, just make cassette copies at the time. Or actually, I think the first batch we got were reel-to-reels. You'd sit in his basement studio where there was no rhyme or reason to where any recording was, but he had a 200-page catalog of everything. And if you went through that catalog and you said, that's what I want, he could go to the shelf and go like that. And so I went there several times collecting old-time music, collecting women in old-time music. These are commercial recordings, and yodelers. So back in the 70s, that's how I got introduced to Patsy Montana. And here we are, you know, in 1980, somebody telling me I could meet her. It was amazing. Now, Patsy also knew Cousin Emmy. Not so much from having crossed paths on radio shows, although they probably did. But Cousin Emmy ended up moving out to California from Kentucky. And I think they crossed paths out there. So the first time I was at Patsy's, I eyed this thing up on a shelf. And I looked at it and I said, Patsy, who is that doll? There was this doll, somebody with blonde hair and a gingham skirt, holding a banjo. She goes, oh, that doll is a Cousin Emmy doll. And I said, what's that from? She said, well, we did a fundraiser. She had some health problems. And so all the country musicians around here did a fundraiser luncheon, and these dolls were the centerpiece of the tables. And of course, I coveted that doll for quite a long time. And Marcy and I produced Patsy's very last album. And when it was over, she said, you know, I think I owe you something. I'm going to send you that Cousin Emmy doll. I'm donating it to the museum. but it's a great keepsake. So people have asked me, why would it be the case that men could have assumed, or sometimes still assume, that women couldn't play a hot bluegrass lick, couldn't play a hot flat pick guitar, couldn't keep up with a bluegrass band or an old time band or whatever. And I think that, in fact, I think you'd have to ask men that question. Why, because it's not women who thought they couldn't do it. And I also think, again, there's a long-term process of education. I'm sorry, but men have been brought up to believe that they could be better at almost anything until recent times. And in every job, women have had to prove their worth. Women have had to prove their abilities, right? There's a reason why there's a movie behind the book, behind the story, Hidden Figures in science. It's not just music, it's everything. And, music is one small piece of that. And, so you have women like Alison Krauss, Laurie Lewis. Gradually, somebody believed in them enough, and they believed in themselves enough to prevail and to show this to be different. But I think that it was a mindset. I absolutely grew up in a male-dominated household. And it wouldn't have occurred to my father to let me have my own thoughts. That didn't work out for him. But I feel like the trajectory of women in old-time music, in terms of visibility of women in old-time music, has followed the trajectory of women's visibility in everything else. In the struggle for equality, the struggle for the Equal Rights Amendment, the struggle for, equal pay. This is not unusual. And I think it's one of the things that's made it harder for women. To this day, I know a lot of all-female bands who call up festivals to, potentially get a gig and are told, we already have our female band. That still happens. We're not there yet. We've made progress. It's not, the same thing's been happening in the world of the recording industry. There are some amazing women engineers. And Marcy and I have 2 Grammy Awards. Each one says artist, producer, engineer. And the engineer part, I'm very proud of that. And I will tell you that our mentors for the most part, were 2 amazing men who continuously said to us, there's no reason why you can't do this. Let me show you how you do this. Go home and do this. And those same 2 men are still in our circle with some others. And we feel it's our job to turn around and say to other women, yeah, you can do this. Let's get you the gear and let's start making it happen. But I don't always only do that with women. I feel that by I've worked with a lot of young men and women in bluegrass, old-time music, and in recording. And I feel like my work with women in encouraging them and giving them the sense of self and self-worth and value is really important. When I work with young men, I'm able to help them recognize that, especially if they came from a place where that might not have been part of their tradition. If I had grown up the way my father intended me to, I would have been subservient to a man for the rest of my life, because that's where he thought we belonged. And so we really can't fault people for how they grew up, but we can be mentors in showing them other ways of thinking and doing. And to me, that's how we make change. You can't make change by just strengthening one side. Change happens by having a whole conversation. I feel that it was my father's perception of, and it was a perception of the time as well. He was brought up to believe that. And then, that's what he was going to pass on. And nobody came along and bopped him on the head and said, no, dude, that ain't how it works, So I don't fully fault him for that, but I was never destined to that path. By the time I was 2 years old, I already didn't believe in that path. And, where that comes from, I can't even guess. But I really enjoy the opportunity to help women find their strength, to find their musical strength. And, the other thing is, there's more than one way to use music in making the world a better place. It isn't all performing. There's teaching, there's music therapy, there's so many different opportunities. And, at the same time as I want women to feel like there's a path if you want to do that commercial route. And when I say commercial, I'm not talking about having a big hit. I don't know a thing about that, and I probably never will. But the route of performing and making a lot of your living from it. But I also encourage people to think about the other ways that they can be using this music. And when I think of, one great example is my friend Helen White, who's no longer here, but she started the Junior Appalachian Musicians Program. And that program, lots and lots of boys, lots and lots of girls have gone through that program, have risen up, have made music a big part of their lives, whether or not they've chosen to make it a part of their livelihood. And Helen had the strength to say, this is really important. And the number of kids who have benefited from that, and they grow up with teachers who are wide open and want them to have this music in their lives. And that's amazing. I think it is getting better, but I do feel that there's still a lot of challenges for women on the business side of the music industry. It doesn't matter what part of the industry it is, but my experiences in folk, old-time, roots music kind of world, it hasn't happened in a long time, thank goodness, but I've had many of those experiences where at the end of the night, a promoter will look at me and say, here's your money. And I'll go, no, that's not what you promised me. We have a contract. Well, here's your money. And I'm like, no, I'm going to stand here till you pay me the whole thing. That's a nice story. There are so many women who experienced way less nice stories about not being paid equally, about not being paid what they were promised, about not being valued on stage, about being demeaned on stage, about being demeaned backstage. And I think one of the things about how society has moved forward is it's a lot easier to say, no, sorry, you can't treat me like that. And the other thing is when other women see you say that, it empowers them. Those challenges continue to exist. It continues to exist that there are definitely presenters, oh, we already have girls. We have our girl. I don't only want to see equity in the general makeup of the festival. I want to see it backstage. I want to see it at the soundboard. I want to see it on the organizing team. I want to see it everywhere. There are a lot of women in old time music that are like a woman that I met named Lois Short. Lois was from Harlan, Kentucky. She ended up, I think, being discouraged from playing music by her husband, put the banjo and guitar under the bed, ignored the music for a very long time. And after he passed away, you know, kids like me, it wasn't me, but kids like me, I think from Apple Shop knocked on the door. Anybody here play any music? Well, I got a banjo and a guitar under the bed, you know, that kind of thing. Lois ended up performing for Apple Shop. And eventually I had the great pleasure of meeting her at the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, at some social justice gathering that we were having. And she was the happiest person in the world to be playing her guitar and playing her banjo. Now, she didn't have as much of a big, long repertoire from her history. She had a repertoire from music that she heard on the radio. She loved the Carter Family. You know, Doc Boggs learned lots of music off the radio. Doc Boggs played old-time banjo to Sarah Martin's blues songs that were being played on the radio. And Lois had that kind of repertoire. We must have stayed up all night, 3 nights in a row, playing every Carter Family song there was, playing all kinds of stuff. She managed to get to a couple of the old-time music camps. And her story is not uncommon, that she was discouraged from playing the music and eventually somebody brought it back out of her. And I mention her partly because she was just one of the sweetest people that I ever met, but also because this was a hidden figure. This was one of the, you know, Lois would have loved to have had a commercial country career, which in her day would have been not unlike a Cousin Emmy kind of career. Although she wasn't she wasn't a comedian the way Cousin Emmy was, but near and dear to my heart, one of the truly sweet people in this music. I think it's going to be important going forward for us to continue documenting the stories of women in old-time music, to continue presenting them, to put together, you know, great archives. But beyond the archives, because archives often require a lot of work to go digging and finding what you want, you know, I look forward to opportunities to put together short specials that people can go to online. Oh, you want to see a 15-minute thing on Cousin Emmy? Let's go there. You want to see, or for instance, one of my favorites that I just have to speak about is the series called Southern Songbirds that Rachel Goodman did about, I guess, sometime in the late 1980s. And I helped her with a few of the segments. And it's audio interviews. None of us had this kind of video equipment back then. It's audio interviews with, I think, 10 or 12 phenomenal women with great stories. And it's all free on SoundCloud. I want more of that. But not only do I want that, then I want people talking about it so that we go there. Podcasts, radio shows, more dissemination of the information so that it's more prominent in our psyches. Old-time music is continuously progressing. It's not a stagnant kind of music, right? So I see a future of old-time music that continues to document and embrace the best of the past, the incredible library of fiddle tunes and banjo tunes and dance music that becomes this great social music opportunity at fiddlers' conventions and festivals and backyard parties. But I also see it moving forward in ways that there are new tunes. There are new songs written in ways that are related to the tradition, but also speak to today. This music, the roots of this music spoke to the times, and the times changed. The music needs to change with it. And I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about a lot of the women who are playing the music that's making that happen. They're keeping sparks alive from the past, and they're creating amazing new flames from those sparks. And I'm excited for that to just keep on going.